Training Center, Jennifer Quinla and Tim Zeidner from the Research Department will be talking to us about missionary language learning. We're excited to have them with us and to hear what they have to share with us. So if you'll please join me in welcoming both Jennifer and Tim. 12:50.
Okay. Okay. Hi. Some of you saw me present not that long ago, so you're like probably sick of me. But Tim,
You'll be sick of very soon.
we're going to just talk about some things looking at 2019 in review. Sure, that's great. So we worked on some projects over the last year, and this is kind of where we are and the things that we're testing now this year, or as a result of what we found. So some kind of key findings, our burning platform, so to speak, are that language proficiency is generally lower than it needs to be for effective missionary work among our language-assigned missionaries. And that missionaries want help with that, and they responded favorably to some of the interventions that we tested and are developing. So now, how did we get there?
And if I can just, and I won't say much, but I guess this is the relevant portion. Like for y'all in the work that the coursework that you're doing and what you're studying is, how would I go about trying to evaluate or understand, a key objective, and so that's what the rest of this is really about. Maybe less about the actual content of what we're sharing and more about the process of how we get there.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Spoken like a true researcher.
thank you. That's all I'll say.
So we have some key questions that we needed answers to. One is we didn't really have a good read on what the language level is of missionaries, nor what their needs are. And so we wanted to get a good sense of that. And then if there's a gap between the needs and where they really are, can we bridge that gap? So let's start by learning about our language needs analysis. Do you, yeah, that was a transition. Do you want to talk about some of the methodology and background of the needs analysis?
Sure, I'll just do that briefly. We worked together with Troy Cox and a group on campus to identify what missionaries really need to do and accomplish in their service, regardless of whether they're learning the language or not. Some of that learning came from a heavy textual analysis of Preach My Gospel. Some of that came from Troy doing key stakeholder interviews. And then we also interviewed a variety of return missionaries from different areas of the world to gain a clear understanding of the tasks, and that's kind of a gross term, but the tasks that missionaries need to perform in order to accomplish their purpose. Then we even did some cog labbing with missionaries on the phrasing and the terms of those tasks and the response categories, so that we can be sure that missionaries, when we sent this survey out to them, asking them how often do you do this and what these things that they needed to do, that there was real clarity, that we were getting consistency from the missionaries in their interpretation of what we were asking them to respond to. And that would tell us, because we could code those tasks in terms of a scale of language proficiency, whether that task required something in the advanced language ability or an intermediate or a novice, and the frequency with which missionaries needed to accomplish those tasks. So that's part A. What is the actual need for them to do in language, at what scale and how often?
And so some examples of what those are, you can see up here. But when you think about meaningful missionary work, clearly introducing yourself and reciting memorized passages is going to last you for so long in the mission field.
But they do that a lot.
But they do it a lot. So
that's
high
a
frequency.
common activity.
Yeah, high frequency. But in terms of where we hope missionary work goes, we hope it doesn't stop here. So, and this kind of gives you a sense of we're aligning with a national proficiency scale for language levels. So novice moving up to superior, you see it kind of expands. So over time, as you become more advanced in your proficiency, it takes progressively more time to advance. So as the cone widens, your steps get a little larger and the breadth of what you're accomplishing is a little wider.
Yeah, and just to give you a couple of examples, so in intermediate, one thing that they do often is follow up on a commitment. That's an intermediate level language skill to do. It's not super deep. You can kind of just say, were you able to do this? It's a question and answer kind of thing, as long as there aren't really any complications in that. But an advanced thing you can see there is understanding the underlying reason for why someone failed to keep a commitment, which includes kind of, understanding maybe some things that arose, some challenges, and reading what people are saying beyond their words. So that's an advanced level language need.
And what we learned from the needs analysis is that over half of missionaries' daily tasks actually take place at an advanced level in a typical missionary life. So now we kind of have a benchmark. Oh, in the field, we're going to hope that they get up to the advanced level. In the MTC, to prepare them for success at an advanced level, we feel like we need to get them to an intermediate level. So we conducted a baseline analysis of Category 1 languages, which are kind of the easy languages like Spanish, French, and Category 4, which are the most difficult languages like Japanese, Korean, etc. So we did an analysis in Japanese and Spanish to assess then where are missionaries currently, what levels are they getting to, and we found out they're not getting to those proficiency targets that we might hope, intermediate and advanced. The majority are not getting to that.
Well, we've found a little bit of difference. For those that go to Spanish countries, they're getting to advanced
by the end of their
first year or a little earlier. Those that are stateside with Spanish speaking, it takes them longer. In Japanese, as you might imagine, it just takes a long time to get to an advanced ability. And so that's what this is a Spanish chart. Sorry, I fiddled with the mic, so that probably bothered somebody. And you can see a little bit of a comparison against what was done historically with some data that was gathered at BYU a decade ago.
So the blue line is back in 2005, red is 2007, yellow was this period of time from 2012 to 2017, and then the green is what we just conducted last year. So the blue, yellow, and red are data that was conducted by BYU, and the green is what we conducted in our baseline. But you can see if we've got intermediate level, advanced level, superior level, that there has been a decrease in proficiency since 2005, actually. So now we know what are the needs, where are we at, and next is what can we do to bridge the gap. So we tried some tests, and here's a little overview of some of those tests. In the field, we discovered that missionaries and support people like their trainer, their district leader, their mission president, ecclesiastical, anyone, they don't know their language level. And they don't know what they should do to improve it because they don't know if it needs to really be improved, except if someone says, I don't understand you. Clearly they know there's something to do, but what? So one of our interventions was to develop an assessment, and we worked with a company, Jake Burtis, who's also an IP&T alum, I do believe. He's got a company that produces an elicited imitation test. And the concept with this assessment is that it tests tacit knowledge in a language, and it uses an algorithm to then produce an evaluation of your language. So we tied that to a diagnostic feedback page that gives some specific tips, types of topics that are appropriate for the level where you test it out, resources that you can use to improve your level, and specific types of activities that can also help push your level up, as well as specific learning strategies to keep your language progressing. So it's a pretty high level thing, right? We're not diving into specific like, oh, you've got a problem with past tense, or your subject-verb agreement, you've got errors all over the place. No, this is like high level. And we did this test with 8 Spanish missions and 6 Japanese missions. Tim mentioned the difference between international assigned and US assigned. you'll see we did have half of our Spanish missions were assigned Spanish speaking but US location, and then half that were Latin America or Spain. Yeah, Peter?
Did you consider, especially with the Spanish and stateside Spanish folks for whom Spanish was a language spoken at home, or maybe their first generation?
Yeah, we gathered information on the missionary to hold those constant so that we could look at the impact of the intervention. The interventions in this case, and Jen's kind of touched on it a little bit, the intervention really was taking the assessment in a quarterly fashion and getting some type of feedback. This PDF is the feedback we gave them. We contracted with another group to do some research. We don't know how much the PDF was actually used. But what we did discover was that taking an assessment in a quarterly fashion and something that they did with it made a marked difference between them and a baseline that we had gathered a couple of years earlier. So we compared them at the same point in time of mission service, and we found that they were a complete sub-level higher than those of their counterparts in the baseline, which is genuinely a marked difference in the impact of intervention. And then we did coaching with that as well. The coaching was uneven because of a number of factors, but missionaries' ability to kind of take the time out and some other factors. But the intervention of at least taking an assessment to see where am I in the language. And we could probably infer, what some of the reasons why that improved, but just taking that assessment caused a marked difference. Did that answer your question though? You were asking whether...
Yeah, so control variables were previous experience with language and
yeah,
creating
historical,
heritage
so heritage speakers or other, time of study in the language before they started their mission or other languages studied. We gathered that information and then we controlled for those as we looked at the intervention measure. Yeah.
I just asked, so before on your previous slide you had where they were at, what did you use to assess that?
Yeah, I'll just tell you really quickly. This ACTFL, the American Council of Teaching Foreign Languages, they have an assessment called the Oral Proficiency Interview, and there's a computer-based one, so it's called the OPIC. We use the OPIC for all of these assessments, so it's a common standard. It's an interview standard that's heavily vetted and expensive to use, and that's what BYU had used in the past. That's what we used in 2019 to gather this baseline data. We also did EI baseline data and used EI to look at this intervention. So that's what showed, and we've got some crosswalk between the EI and the ACTFL scale, even though they're different assessments to see the range in which, if you took the elicited imitation assessment, where would you roughly be on the ACTFL scale?
We got a question from the chat too, if that's
please.
okay. Ben is asking if you were able to determine the cause of the decrease in proficiency.
No, that was historical data that was collected by BYU, so we don't know the...
There are a lot of theories.
Yeah.
There's not a real easy way to test that, genuinely.
A lot of variables changed in that period of time.
Yeah. I'll say if we went back to this, the one thing that Jen and I were literally talking about this yesterday, all of the data except for the green line was gathered by BYU. Our green line was captured by all missionaries at end of service. All missionaries at end of service don't go to BYU. So there's a select subset that goes to BYU. There's a select subset still that focuses in on language after they come. I would imagine that there are a number of variables that might suggest the difference between what our measurement might be and what a measurement might be from BYU, if that makes sense, including sampling differences in what we're looking at. So, but the answer, the short answer is we're not sure.
Okay, I've got
Other things changed in the MTC too, like length of tenure for
Yes.
language assignments, Preach My Gospel, different curricular interventions that changed.
The
so
age change and the
age
time
change.
of training in the MTC are major
And with the
Very.
surge of missionaries, you have missionaries becoming trainers younger in their mission tenure, so maybe
Yeah.
less experience in the language, and
True.
coming home with maybe less robust language skills, and then teaching in the MTC. So,
She has another question.
oh, yeah.
Actually, I think you may have addressed it. Marianne asked what about
Oh,
shortening the time in the
right.
MTC to learn language?
Yeah,
Call me.
okay. So that's the quarterly assessment, made an impact. Another thing we identified here is that it's great for missionaries to know, but it turns out mission presidents want to know also. And so this is a very loose mock-up, but a concept that we'll be trying out this year is then generating a report that will go to mission presidents that they can have an awareness of, oh, how are the language skills in my mission, and what does that mean that they'll be able to do in mission skills, and that's from that language needs analysis that you saw earlier.
Can I do an aside for just a second? So many moons ago, I did my PhD, and my dissertation was about the effect of education, of educating what's available for how people decide the degree to which they go on for post-secondary education. So I had a big national data set that I looked at, and looked at states that educated their students on what they needed to do to go on for post-secondary education. It turns out that the role of education, of awareness, plays a role in it impacts what you do as you go on in education, whether you go on for 2 years or 4 years. This is nothing new to you guys, but it's just and so this nestled idea of the importance of awareness or education or information to a person that might be growing in the language or growing in something that they're studying, and to the person that's kind of in charge of the culture of learning and growing and what they focus on, in this case a mission president, seems to be a key element for helping to improve opportunities or growth for, in this case, missionaries in language, but as you might imagine, other things.
Can you go up one, Tim?
Yeah.
One other thing,
Backward?
yeah. So this year, what we're doing based on our findings is the EI is available in 5 languages right now. Pretty soon it'll be 10, and that will cover almost 90% of language assigned missionaries. So we'll be implementing this testing in field as a systematic, regular part of missionary service this year. So that's kind of an exciting thing. Here's another thing that we tried. We had a problem that I mentioned earlier. Missionaries said they don't know what to study, so they've got language study time for an hour every day. But what to study? I've got the stuff that I got in the MTC, or I could read general conference talks, or I could ask my companion.
I can read the Book of Mormon out loud and record
Yeah.
myself.
Right.
There's a lot of things
Lot of
that
things.
missionaries do to learn language.
And so this test was to just try delivering a structured study resource. And the question we wanted to ask is, could we use an out-of-the-box language course, like a BYU Online language course, and would it respond to this need effectively and also maybe move the needle on their language skills? Well, what we discovered, so we tested this with French, German, and Russian. We took 3 courses from BYU Online, tested them with missionaries in the field, and we had great participation for about 5 weeks, and then it just dropped off significantly. A lot of factors impacted that. One was they were using old computers at the church that were just really, really slow. They thought they didn't have enough data to work on the course, so they'd be like, I hit 1 gig, I'm not going to do any more. They also, in one mission, they thought they couldn't use earbuds, and so then it was kind of awkward. But the biggest impact for participation was that the courses didn't align with what we knew from the language needs analysis, what their actual linguistic needs were. So they say, like, why am I reading Antigone? Like, I need to know how to talk about these important things with like real, natural, normal words, and I'm like reading French literature. This isn't working for me. Like, thanks for building my vocabulary, but I want to be able to apply it today, kind of thing. So they loved the concept of the course, but they didn't love the alignment with their actual needs.
Implementation is hard from 5,000 miles.
Yeah.
Even trying to convey that this might have value in another way doesn't always easily get to the end of the row for helping them understand why this intervention could be helpful. You know, you get a lot of things, telephone, that you have to go through that by the end of the time it gets there, not necessarily what you're trying to communicate.
Yeah.
So.
The other thing with the Russian course was it had a hard copy textbook that accompanied the course. So that got sent back from Customs twice. And it was like, oh, Customs has to have someone from the mission office sign off on this. And the mission office would say, I've been calling them every day. You know, it was just like, this is not going to happen. And eventually it got rerouted back to the publisher. Anyway, so what we're going to do next on this, based on this test, is we discovered, hey, we need to understand a little bit more about the culture of language learning in missions that might impact likelihood of implementation being successful.
Yeah, and
So-
just some of those quick questions are, to what degree is language, like some intervention in language, needed? Where would you put it in your priority list of things that you're trying to focus on? Just so we can right-size our expectations of what an intervention might do. How would you receive this? What is it that you're looking for? What do you currently use, and what do you need, and what would be the best way to get that? So a little customer listening might really help us hone what better interventions might be. Jason and I did some work together, customer listening missionaries this past year, trying to understand a little more of their MTC experience and just hearing from them in a journey mapping style way. And this is in that same vein of trying to understand, what do you do, where would this fit, what is it that you need, what works.
So before we try to make a study resource fit for them, we need to go back and understand the culture and their needs better.
So we have a question from the chat. Did the online courses have experiences with native speakers, meaning the pre-missionaries were able to talk to natives, or was it all just theory?
They weren't pre-missionaries,
No.
they were in-field missionaries.
These are in-field missionaries, and they use fully asynchronous online courses. So some of those courses do have authentic material with native speakers in them. It was not theoretical. They were practical courses, especially the German course, which was a heavy grammar focus. But they were courses aligned with the proficiency level that we thought missionaries would be for the amount of time that they were out in the field. So I don't know if that gets at your question.
She's nodding.
Okay, great. In the MTC, we did a test, and we're still in this place. So, insufficient language skills for typical missionary functions when they're leading the MTC. I mentioned that from our baseline, we discovered that in our Category 4 languages, missionaries weren't hitting intermediate, and in Spanish, in our Category 1 languages, a percentage were, but not as many as we'd like. So our test was to separate learning objectives. So there are two kind of gross batches of learning objectives happening for a language assigned missionary. Learning their job, their call as a missionary, their role as a missionary, teaching skills, doctrinal knowledge, etc., preach my gospel stuff, and the language. And historically, that's kind of been like this. So you're diving into language on doctrinal concepts that you might not fully understand in English, let alone in the language.
And if I can add, like, doctrinal concepts is one aspect, but like how to do your job,
Yeah.
like as a missionary, which is to help people, to listen to people, to understand their needs, find out what you might share or invite them to do. Those things are not intuitive before you go on a mission. And so that objective of, can you learn and understand what you need to do just in your own time before you progress into matching that with needing to do this in somebody else's time.
Mhm.
It was that separation of objectives, being able to perform your purpose and that being clear in your own native tongue before.
So, our guest here, David McFarland, designed a curriculum that separated those objectives. So 2 weeks of intensive learn your job in English, and then 4 weeks of intensive language. So we call it 2x4.
Because they got hit by
So this is our Spanish 2x4 test that we ran last year. And what we discovered were some interesting things. Now remember, in a typical 6-week Spanish instruction, they start speaking Spanish like on day 2. So calendar day wise, they have 6 weeks of days where they're probably having exposure to language. In the 2x4, they have their hour of language study every day during those 2 weeks, and that's it in the language. So then they really are getting 4 weeks of targeted language practice. So calendar-wise, a shorter amount of time. Hours-wise, we don't know, because every teacher in the traditional program varies how much they speak Spanish versus English, or what activities they say, ooh, I can tell nobody's understanding, let's dial this back and do it in English. Yeah.
For the 4 weeks of language, are they doing language of Preach My Gospel, or is
Yes.
it strictly grammar?
Yeah, the content is still related, and David could speak to this better, but the content is still all oriented toward their job, right? Which is help to teach the gospel and invite others to come. So it's all Preach My Gospel. The role is just a deeper dive into that, rather than, like Jen just now mentioned, kind of flipping up and back between objectives. It's really trying to accomplish a clear objective here, and then trying to accomplish this clear objective based on that earlier objective here.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
So we were a little worried that language actually might decrease because it's this shorter amount of calendar time of exposure to the language in a structured way. And we found that language held out okay.
We
And
had the
then-
same scores in language,
Yeah,
but we did this assessment at the end, and they essentially had the exact same scores in language. So it didn't impact language scores by doing this.
but it did impact.
It impacted a couple of other things. It impacted their feelings of anxiety or preparedness and some core things. It was positive by separating those two objectives.
Yeah.
The other thing that was really interesting is it impacted their ability to teach in the language as measured by the person being taught. So we have missionaries teach people in the MTC in practice, and those people give feedback through a survey, a codified survey. And what we found is that missionaries that had this experience doing it in English before doing it in language, that they were better able to read the needs of people. That's what these scores show here. The differences between the control group and the pilot group is that they had a marked difference in being able to understand and read and discern how somebody felt based on their teaching more than those that were in the traditional style of English.
Okay.
Question from the chat, Marianne asks, are there studies that correlate higher foreign language proficiency with better missionary outcomes?
Well,
So, no. I mean, the short answer is no, Marianne, but the long answer is, as kind of the point of the language needs analysis, is correlating the things that you're doing in daily missionary work to kind of a linguistic proficiency scale. That helps us kind of identify if you have these language skills, then you can do these kind of effective missionary functions. Does that make sense? Okay, yeah.
It looks like there was a
Microphone,
jump in the control.
microphone, microphone, please.
It looks like there was a jump in the control group as far as their language speaking abilities. Am I reading that chart right?
no.
So it went from 4.8 to 5.6.
This isn't in their language speaking ability. This is in their ability to discern teaching people. So there was a growth in them. That's correct. You are reading the
Okay.
chart correctly. Just wanted, this is not on their language ability. This is their ability to discern how somebody felt after they taught them in the language. So when they went to go teach an individual in the language and that person responded, and then we got a survey that said, how do you think they responded to these different things? And if we were close, we call that you discerned that well. And if they were further apart, we said you didn't. And that's what these scores are based on. So they did grow in their ability. That's correct. They were still just considerably lower than the pilot group in that ability.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
great. Did that answer your question? Or no? It seems like not.
Well, it's just interesting that the control group grew in that ability as much as they did.
It's
The
a,
pilot group didn't grow. I mean, they were higher, but they didn't grow.
Yeah, it's an average of a point on a 10-point scale,
Oh, okay.
so, yeah.
Okay. Last thing was pre-MTC, and some of you might have heard of whisperings of pre-MTC. So again, this was kind of to tackle the problem of when they're exiting the MTC, they're not getting quite to the language skills they hope, and so the concept was, could we preload some language training before they even come to the MTC? And from May to October, missionaries who were assigned Spanish speaking going to the Mexico MTC were invited to participate in pre-MTC, so one-on-one training with a language coach in a Zoom setting type of thing. And we used Tall Embark app, which actually, incidentally, any member of the church can use the Embark language learning app, if you're interested. So we used the Embark app, and that's really task-based. So they could start learning things like how to say a prayer in Spanish, how to share a scripture in Spanish, how to meet someone in Spanish, things like that.
Introduce yourself.
Yeah, introduce yourself. So what we discovered was participating and completing 2/3 or more of this basic core is what we call it. It's a chunk of these tasks. If they completed 2/3 or more of this curriculum, they did have slight language gains. That's what you're seeing at the top. However, those gains were lost unless they were grouped in a cohort in the MTC. And in that case, the gains actually became significant. So just completing this curriculum in pre-MTC didn't have not a statistically significant impact on their language, but being cohorted did. And of course, you can say a lot of things about the cohorts, like, well, that's motivated people or people who participated already. They made time to participate, therefore they're, more likely to be dedicated to their study, etc. We didn't dive in on all the reasons why, but what we did discover is it in fact helped us get to that target of intermediate when they had done basic core and they had been cohorted in their pre-MTC. You want to say anything else about that?
No, I
Okay.
think that's great. So now you got to see kind of what the needs were, some different types of interventions that we tried, and kind of our next steps or where we're headed. So with that, I thought Jen did an awesome job, so I'm going to clap for Jen.
Any other questions? Obviously, you can see there's a lot of, and this is true with any type of research with language learning, there are a lot of variables that contribute to language gains. A lot. Everything from affect to environment to curricular interventions to types of approaches in the pedagogy to length of time studied to intensity of study. I mean, like, so many variables. So just like with studying any human research, any human subjects, when you're researching those, there are a lot of variables, and some of them are controllable and some of them aren't.
Can I mention one last thing? Because we work for the MTC, I think it's important for people to understand a little bit of our take on this as well. I'm a researcher for a living. This is what I do. I evaluate programs and interventions. Having said all of that, so again, I work at the MTC. This is a work that's not my work. This is a work that is God's work. And His interventions are far more impactful than our interventions. We're trying to align to whatever degree we can with what He would have us do to bless and help missionaries and those that they're trying to help invite to return and to draw closer to Him. We do our work to better understand this, but I'd be remiss to say that we think that we're the important cog in this. What we do is important and matters, but really what matters is how He does His work in the lives of each of His children, including His missionaries. We believe that learning language is a gift. It's a gift of the Spirit. And that requires effort, and that requires intangibles, not related to this, things that deal with attributes, that deal with faith. And and the other ways that we can't measure those things. So I just wanted to
Yeah.
kind
And I
of
guess
be clear what.
that's kind of where I was going, is that there are lots of variables, and this isn't the type of research where we are going to try to control every variable. Our hope is that we can identify variables that where we can have an impact with what we do, and that can empower missionaries to be able to do things with their missionary work, which language is the tool to assist them to do that. So,
We do have a couple of questions in the chat.
okay.
Spencer asks, how does MTC language learning compare with other similar programs?
So we visited DLI, Defense Language Institute. Dave visited Middlebury in a group. Some similarities, but they visited us too. I think everybody's really surprised that we keep them for such a short amount of time, that we do what we do, and that they have the level of success that they have, genuinely. Like, that's not like a genuinely in the field. We've indicated that we want them to be at greater levels based on our learning and study. Having said that, it's remarkable, genuinely remarkable, what missionaries can do and what they do in the language as they serve throughout. Because how we compare to other programs is like what, 1/20th of?
You might want to talk in the microphone.
Yeah, so Middlebury is similar in terms of length of
Yeah,
stay, but they don't assess for proficiency, so it's hard to make a comparison there. DLI has a much longer stay. They're similar in purpose in what they're doing. They're trying to prepare soldiers to be mission ready, but their courses are 36 to 72 weeks long compared to the 6 or 9 weeks at the MTC, and they don't assess all along the way. So an apples to apples comparison of what are you getting for the time spent in the DLI versus the MTC isn't possible. We know what their exit scores are, and their exit scores could be comparable to what we see with, at least for Spanish, what we see with missionaries reaching by the end of their service.
Some of my colleagues in the language field are always like, how on earth can your missionaries get to such high levels in language when in the university setting it is just like pulling teeth to get them by the end of 202 to like a reasonable intermediate level. And I think a really important differentiation is we have a highly targeted, highly motivated learner in a missionary. Not only do they have a deep belief that they're called by God, but they also have a deep desire. They opted in to this program, and they have a deep desire to do something very specific with their language. So a typical university student in the 100 to 200 level is probably fulfilling a GE requirement, or if they're on a track to be a language major, they have like this broad, probably scheme of
Literature.
things that they might be learning in the language. So it's not as targeted, I guess. And they may not believe that God has called them to learn the language. They might, but ours systematically do.
Yeah, so MTC is
So,
really quite different.
Really unique, yeah.
So second question from Susanna. Do you have any issues of mission presidents not being compliant in in-field tests? Thinking back to my experience in Germany, my mission president probably wouldn't have been so keen on allotting us time to travel to the church to do online course. For him, that would take too much time from proselyting.
It's a great question, and that touches at something that we know is that how mission presidents feel about language learning in general impacts how missionaries learn language. So,
And mission presidents have, as anybody probably would guess, like more to prioritize than you could possibly
Yeah.
imagine. And they have accountability to their ecclesiastical leaders for a number of things as well. And so, yeah, it's variant by mission president. That's correct. And we're working towards, even in implementing missionaries taking an assessment once every 3 or 4 transfers, we'll take some help in saying this is important across the board, so that the buy-in and the time to do that would be
Yeah, so it definitely matters. Any other questions? Yeah, Peter.
So one question, and then after that I've got a comment, if there's time. I'm wondering if there's a point at which of diminishing returns. I'm a big fan of learning language and improving your language, but where the purpose obviously is to be able to communicate, and it's great you've looked at those actual levels and identified tasks for missionaries at those different levels. Is there a point of diminishing returns for language proficiency and the needs and purpose of a missionary to be able to communicate with others?
Can I take a shot? And do you mind if I take a shot? I had this conversation yesterday with somebody.
Please do.
So, missionary work, like, can you get to superior in anything? Teaching, like, God is superior. I think there's always room for growth. And not just the room for growth, but the desire to be an instrument that will grow. So I don't know if the target about, like, I can stop studying language. One of the things that's embedded behind that is how much do I care about the people that I'm trying to help, so that I can understand and read and even understand kind of the context behind some things that they might say, because I never grew up in this country. So I don't know, I mean, I understand the way you're framing the question, but I think there's an issue about humility, that not just in language, but any growth for a missionary, in being a useful instrument in his hands and always trying to grow and become. And that's not just a missionary element, right? That's something that all of us are trying to become and are kind of eons away from becoming it anyways. So I don't know if there's the way I read that in some ways, and I know there's choice sets, like I need to spend more time on this or this or this, but to think that I've kind of arrived is a damning kind of thought in its most literal sense, right? And that cuts us off maybe to continued growth and ability to be used spiritually in ways that, so those that say I've capped off, there's a concern, whether they said that about language, or I've mastered how to teach this lesson, or I've mastered how to work with a member, or I've mastered whatever. That notion of mastery, when you're the instrument, not the one doing the work, is I would say is probably a bit of a challenge to being useful.
And the notion of proficiency is what you can do in spontaneous, unplanned situations. So if you think of missionary life, it's a lot of spontaneous, unplanned situations. When something doesn't happen the way you expected it to happen, or someone wants to talk to you when you didn't think anyone would want to talk to you, or, this whole spectrum of experiences. And our language, even if we were an English assigned missionary and English were our primary language, our language will evolve in English as we learn how to respond to all of these different scenarios as a missionary. So, let alone in the foreign language. But if we get to a point where there's diminishing returns, I'm sure we'll measure it.
It's a great question. It really is.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And you had a comment too.
Yeah, so are we about at time right now?
Couple more minutes.
We got a couple more minutes. I guess the comment was a plug for all of your research and your questions you might have. A lot of the things that have been talked about here today are things that IP&T grads worked on when they were here.
Yeah.
The elicited imitation, I don't know if you're using Carrie Thompson's original for the Spanish test.
No,
You've
come a little ways.
It's iterated, but it was definitely a foundation early on. Wasn't
Yeah,
it?
and we saw, you talked with Russian, so there were 3 of our students who did different EI tests at the MTC, and they've continued to improve those.
Yeah.
David worked on something different, right, obviously, and you've worked on these things. It's fun to kind of see people progress and see where you've come from and the work that you've done as well, so.
Yeah, the EI has been a work of love for at least the last 7 years. Yeah, so it's been instrumental, really, in what we're trying to do.
It's a great point though, Peter, like,
Yeah, and the impact of IP&T.
yeah, has
in
been
general.
significant. And I certainly didn't see my professional path taking me to the MTC. I was, in language curriculum. And yet, here I am applying skills directly from my IP&T experience into now this professional role. Pretty cool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
awesome.
Have you done any studies correlating missionaries who have native speaking companions, how much time they have with native speaking companions in the mission and their language level?
Yeah. So that was another factor we controlled for in surveys on the baseline,
Okay.
like the degree to which they had native companions. It's a really hard thing, actually. You may or may not know what we try to do with native companions. Natives are, the hope for, the plan for the missionary department was that they learn English. And so there's this complicated kind of, they're wanting to learn English from their English-speaking companion, and the other companion is wanting to study the language with that companion. So it's not clear what the dosage, if you will, is of those two elements in terms of language. But it's not something we can easily, it's not a lever that we can pull, because decisions about who to be with and transfers and so forth are really a super prayerful, spiritual process between the mission president S. Keys. And so while it's something we've tried to control for, it's not something that's a lever for us to actually act on. Does that make sense? So.
Okay, we want to thank Jennifer and Tim one more time for a special.